Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of absolute precision.
Oh, for sure. It's almost like engineering in a way.
Right. Like if
Yeah.
you fall off your bike and your arm swells up, you go to the hospital and they put you in front of an X-ray machine.
Hmm.
And that machine gives you a picture, and on that picture there's a stark, jagged white line. The doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is. That is the problem.
Because it's binary. It's a completely objective reality that, well, you, the doctor, and everyone else can just agree on instantly.
Exactly. Broken or not broken, it's clean.
Hmm.
And as a patient, even if it hurts, there's a deep psychological relief in that clarity. Right.
Oh, absolutely.
We love things to be visible. We love when really complex biological problems can be neatly categorized into a yes or a no.
Because, I mean, when the problem is visible and binary, the solution usually is too. You put a cast on it. End of story.
But then you step into the world of, a global, rapidly evolving health crisis, like a novel virus spreading across the globe.
Right.
And suddenly, that pristine binary X-ray machine is just completely shattered. We aren't looking at a clean, jagged line anymore.
No, not at all.
We're looking at a diagnostic and societal landscape that is incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And here's the thing about muddy waters, right?
Huh?
When you can't see the bottom, the way you interpret the shapes moving beneath the surface, it depends entirely on who is doing the looking.
That's a great point.
It depends on what tools they brought with them to the water's edge, what their past experiences are, and, perhaps most crucially of all, what they're actually terrified of finding.
Which brings us directly to our mission for this deep dive. Welcome, everyone.
Glad to be here.
If you are tuning in because you're a learner, if you are insanely curious about how raw data, powerful institutions, and, human psychology violently collide during a crisis, you are in the exact right place. Because today, we are opening up a massive stack of source material. Specifically, we're looking at excerpts from a really fascinating, highly detailed, and frankly explosive interview from the YouTube channel Café Politique.
It really is explosive.
Yeah, we are going to extract the core insights, the uncomfortable questions, and the mechanics of a society under immense pressure. And the subject of this deep dive is a man named Maurice de Hond.
Now, for those who might not be familiar with the European political landscape, Maurice de Hond is a very well-known, established figure in the Netherlands.
Right.
But he's not a virologist. He's traditionally a pollster. He is a data analyst. His entire career has been built on looking at massive sets of numbers, finding behavioral trends, and, trying to figure out what the public is actually thinking and doing.
Rather than what they say they're doing.
Exactly. He looks for the hidden variables.
And during the COVID-19 pandemic, he took that specific skill set, right? That pollster's eye for data manipulation and behavioral quirks, and he stepped into a completely different arena.
He turned his attention to the national health data.
And in doing so, he became one of the most vocal, heavily scrutinized, and frankly controversial critics of the official Dutch pandemic narrative.
He didn't just disagree quietly either.
No.
He clashed with the central government, he clashed with the top health authorities, and he waged an absolute protracted war of words with the traditional media establishment.
And the interview we're unpacking today is essentially his retrospective on that entire chaotic period. It's his unfiltered view of what went wrong, why it went wrong, and how the fundamental machinery of institutional trust just broke down. But, before we get into the mechanics of his arguments, we need to set the parameters for you, the listener, because we are all dealing with some highly charged material today.
We really are. The source material is deeply critical of the established scientific consensus of that time, of major institutions, and of the media ecosystem.
So here's our rule of engagement for this deep dive. Our job here today is not to endorse de Hond's claims. We aren't here to validate his worldview, nor are we here to play referee and fact-check his every statement against a pile of outside medical journals.
We're engaging in an exercise of pure perspective taking. We're working strictly within the boundaries of the source material provided to us, reporting his exact arguments so we can understand the internal logic of his position.
Because regardless of where you personally fall on the political spectrum or, how you feel about pandemic policies, understanding how a seasoned data analyst looks at government messaging and why he believes the entire system failed is just incredibly valuable.
Oh, for sure.
If you want to understand why society fractured so deeply, you have to be willing to put on the glasses of the person pointing out the cracks in the foundation. You don't have to agree that the house is collapsing to learn something vital about architecture.
That is the perfect way to frame it. The mechanics of dissent are just as important to study as the mechanics of consensus.
Okay, so let's get into it. To really understand de Haan's mindset and where that initial fracture happened between him and the authorities, we have to travel back in time.
Right. Back to the beginning.
Yeah, we need to go back to August of 2020.
August 2020. That is a critical window.
Yeah.
I mean, the world is still very much in the grip of the unknown.
Totally.
We are months into the pandemic, lockdowns are fluctuating, fear is incredibly high, and the scientific community globally is still just trying to nail down the exact physical mechanics of how this virus travels from person A to person B.
And according to the source material, this is the moment when Maurice de Hond starts heavily, loudly advocating for a very specific scientific understanding. He's looking at the global data, and he becomes completely convinced that the virus is primarily driven by aerosols, airborne transmission.
Which was a massive point of contention at the time. We should probably define the difference because it dictates literally everything about how a society responds.
Right.
The dominant theory being pushed by many institutions initially was droplet transmission.
Which means heavy particles, right? Like if I sneeze, heavy droplets of moisture fly out of my mouth. They travel maybe 3 to 6 feet in a parabolic arc, and then they just fall to the ground or onto a surface.
Precisely. And if the enemy is heavy droplets, your policy response is very specific.
You tell people to wash their hands obsessively.
Right. You wipe down groceries, you stand exactly 6 feet apart, and you put up plexiglass shields everywhere at the checkout lines.
Because gravity is pulling the threat down.
Exactly. But aerosols are completely different.
Because they're microscopic.
Right. Aerosols are microscopic. They don't fall. They hang in the air like smoke.
Wow. Okay.
So if someone is infected and they are just breathing or talking in a poorly ventilated room, those tiny particles just accumulate. And if it's aerosols, well, plexiglass doesn't do a thing.
Washing your groceries is useless.
Completely useless. If it's aerosols, the only thing that truly matters indoors is ventilation. You have to cycle the air.
So de Hond is looking at the international data. He notes in the interview that Angela Merkel in Germany was already addressing the aerosol factor in early August. So he's looking around the Netherlands, seeing this obsessive focus on hand washing and plexiglass, and he's trying to sound the alarm. He says, "We are fighting the wrong battle."
And he is incredibly persistent. He shares his findings widely, and he actually manages to get the ear of some key parliamentarians.
Most notably, a member of the Dutch House of Representatives named Fleur Agema.
Yes, Fleur Agema. She takes de Hond's data, she finds it compelling, and she brings it directly onto the floor of Parliament.
Wow.
She essentially forces a public confrontation with the Outbreak Management Team, or the OMT.
And the person she is confronting is Jaap van Dissel. He's the head of the IVM, which is the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment.
Right.
So by default, he is the central, unassailable scientific authority figure in the country at this moment. He is the guy interpreting the X-ray for the entire nation.
Exactly. So paint this picture for me. We are in Parliament. The whole nation is watching.
Okay.
Agema asks Van Dissel, on the official record, what his position is regarding aerosols. Like, why aren't we focusing on ventilation?
Right.
And the response that Van Dissel gives, well, de Hond describes it in the interview as a moment of pure, staggering bewilderment.
It was a response that fundamentally and perhaps permanently broke de Hond's faith in the institutional scientific process.
According to the source, Van Dissel's defense of ignoring aerosols goes like this. He essentially tells Parliament, look at the infection numbers right now. They're almost at zero. We have taken all these other measures, distancing, hand washing, lockdowns, and we haven't taken aerosols into account at all. We haven't mandated ventilation, and yet the numbers have gone to zero.
Okay.
Therefore, his conclusion, stated to the government, is because we ignored aerosols and the problem still went away, aerosols must not be a relevant factor in the spread of the virus.
Wait, hold on. Let me just make sure I'm wrapping my head around this logic, because as a layman, that sounds crazy.
It is crazy.
He's saying, I didn't treat this specific symptom, but the patient got better anyway, so that symptom must never have existed.
That is exactly what he's saying. And it's a stunningly flawed piece of logical deduction, especially coming from an epidemiologist.
But the confounding variable there is the size of Mount Everest.
Okay.
De Hond immediately points out the glaring hole. He says, of course the numbers went down, because every single super spreader event, every concert, every packed church, every crowded office building had been forcibly canceled. The entire society was locked in their homes.
Right. The virus wasn't spreading via aerosols because people weren't gathering in indoor, poorly ventilated spaces anymore. They weren't gathering anywhere.
Okay, let's unpack this. To illustrate just how absurd he found Van Dissel's defense, de Hond uses this analogy in the interview, and it is so biting, but it perfectly crystallizes the frustration.
I love this analogy.
He compares the head of the National Health Institute to a sketch from Sesame Street, Ernie and Bert.
It's a brilliant way to highlight logical absurdity.
Okay, so picture this. Ernie is sitting there with a massive yellow banana shoved in his ear.
Okay.
Bert walks in, completely confused, and says, "Ernie, what in the world are you doing? Why do you have a banana in your ear?"
Right.
Ernie looks at him, totally serious, and says, "I'm keeping the crocodiles away."
Mm-hmm.
Bert looks around the living room, exasperated, and says, "But Ernie, there are no crocodiles here." And Ernie smiles this big, triumphant smile and says, "See? It works."
What's fascinating here is, it's funny, but when you map it onto the national health policy, it is truly terrifying.
Yeah.
What de Hond is pointing out is a classic catastrophic confusion of correlation and causation wrapped in an impenetrable layer of confirmation bias.
I did X, Y didn't happen, therefore X prevents Y. Even if X is a banana and Y is a crocodile.
Exactly. Van Dissel's logic was, I ignored aerosols, the infections dropped, therefore ignoring aerosols was the correct scientific posture.
Wow.
He was completely ignoring the fact that the lockdown itself, the absence of the crocodiles, was the reason the numbers dropped, not his lack of a ventilation policy. By attributing the drop solely to the measures he did believe in, and using that to dismiss the ones he didn't, he was entirely abandoning the basic scientific method.
And de Hond is just furious at this point. He explicitly states in the interview that if a first-year university student had handed in that logic on an exam paper, he would have graded it with an F, a failing grade.
Yeah.
But this isn't a student. This is the guy directing the lives of millions of people.
And I think it's crucial to understand the emotional temperature here. De Hond notes that a lot of people criticized his tone during this period. They said he sounded overly disgruntled, angry, or arrogant. But he clarifies that his tone wasn't born out of a bruised ego. He wasn't yelling because he wanted a medal for being the smartest guy in the room.
No, the stakes were way too high for ego. He says, and this is one of the heaviest quotes from the source material, "I just knew that people were dying unnecessarily." That is where the anger comes from. He viewed this as the biggest crisis since World War II. He's looking at care homes, at elderly facilities with terrible ventilation, where the virus is ripping through the population, and the people in charge are refusing to look at the mechanics of the air because they essentially have a banana in their ear.
He was watching the Dutch economy bleed out and vulnerable people suffer because of what he viewed as stubborn anti-scientific pride.
Yeah.
And eventually, history and the broader scientific community vindicated de Hond's push for aerosols.
They did. The World Health Organization, the WHO, finally changed its official stance and acknowledged airborne transmission. They began heavily promoting ventilation. But de Hond points out that the Netherlands was incredibly slow to adapt. He uses this great imagery comparing the Dutch health authority to the last little village in France that was stubbornly holding out, refusing to surrender to reality before finally being dragged kicking and screaming into updating their guidelines.
But by the time ventilation was finally included in the RVM protocols, a profound shift had occurred in Maurice de Hond. The damage wasn't just the physical toll of the virus, it was the total destruction of his trust in the institutions.
Because if the logic behind the aerosol policy was that fundamentally broken, if the top experts were willing to use student-failing arguments in Parliament to save face, well, de Hond realizes he has a much bigger problem on his hands. He realizes this isn't just an isolated blind spot about air particles. It's a systemic failure of how data is processed and presented.
Which leads us into the most technical and arguably the most devastating part of his critique.
Let's do it.
If the foundational logic is flawed, what happens when a career data analyst turns his magnifying glass on the actual hard numbers being pumped out by the health authorities?
Let's look at the numbers. Because de Hond doesn't just disagree with the RVM's conclusions, he fundamentally attacks their methodology. Based on the interview, he claims that almost every scientific report he reviewed from the authorities during that period had morphed from objective science into something else entirely. He goes so far as to call the reports propaganda.
Which is an incredibly loaded term. Propaganda implies deliberate intent.
Right, a conscious choice.
Exactly. It suggests that the researchers weren't starting with a blank slate and asking, What does the data tell us? Instead, de Hond argues they were starting with a mandated government narrative like get vaccinated or follow these specific rules, and then reverse engineer the data to support that predetermined message.
Okay, I want to really break this down because throwing around the word propaganda is easy, but proving it requires receipts.
And he brings them.
He does, in the form of a massive critique of statistical bias. Let's start with a concrete example he gives regarding testing data.
This is a phenomenal example of how numbers can lie while telling the technical truth. It revolves around what statisticians call a denominator problem.
Okay, before we get to his example, let's make sure everyone is on the same page. What exactly is a denominator problem in this context? Break the math down for me.
Sure. Think of a fraction.
Okay.
The top number, the numerator, is the specific thing you are counting. Say, the number of positive COVID tests.
Got it.
The bottom number, the denominator, is the total pool of people you are looking at the total number of tests taken.
Right.
If you want to know the rate of infection, you need that denominator to be a fair, representative sample of the whole population. If your denominator is corrupted, if it only includes a very specific type of person, then the percentage you get at the end is completely skewed, even if the raw numbers are technically accurate.
Okay. So if I want to know how tall the average American is, and my denominator only consists of players in the NBA,
Your data is completely useless.
right, even if my measurements of those players are 100% accurate.
Exactly. The sample is biased from the start. And de Hond argues this exact mathematical sleight of hand was happening with the national testing data.
So here's the scenario de Hond outlines. The RVM releases a highly publicized report on vaccine efficacy against transmission. In this report, they analyze roughly 500,000 tested individuals. They have a pool of 400,000 unvaccinated people and a pool of 100,000 vaccinated people. They look at the positive test results within those two pools, and they issue a triumphant press release.
And what does it say?
The headline essentially says, the unvaccinated are 3 times more likely to test positive, a factor of 3.
And if you're a journalist or, a citizen just skimming the news, that sounds incredibly definitive. It sounds like a massive victory for the vaccine's ability to stop the spread.
But de Hond looks at this report, and his pollster instincts start screaming. He sees a massive, gaping flaw in the denominator. He realizes that this pool of 500,000 people is not a random controlled sample.
No, it's not.
It's a self-selected group. These are people who voluntarily chose to walk into a testing facility.
And that changes everything about the data. Because you have to ask a behavioral question. Why does someone choose to get tested?
Let's play this out. It's late 2021. Society is heavily divided by mandates. If you are an unvaccinated person during that time, why are you going to a government testing facility?
According to de Hond's analysis, the barrier to entry for an unvaccinated person was very high. They likely only entered that testing system if they felt terrible. They had severe symptoms, a high fever, a terrible cough. They were undeniably sick and needed medical validation or clearance.
Right. They aren't going just for the fun of it. Now, look at the other side. Why does a vaccinated person get tested during that same period?
The threshold is completely different. A vaccinated person might go get a test because they have a tiny tickle in their throat. Or maybe they just have the sniffles.
Or they just want to go to a bar.
Exactly. Very often, they were getting tested simply because they needed a negative result to travel, to go to a concert, or to attend a large social event where proof was required.
Yes. So their threshold for taking a test is virtually non-existent. So what does this all mean for the listener? If you have 2 groups, and Group A, the unvaccinated, only takes the test when they are visibly, actively sick with classic symptoms.
Right.
And Group B, the vaccinated, takes it casually when they feel fine, just to get on an airplane. Aren't you just comparing apples and oranges?
You absolutely are. You are mathematically guaranteeing that the percentage of positive results in Group A will be artificially higher, not because the virus is inherently spreading 3 times faster among them in the wild, but because your denominator for Group A consists almost entirely of sick people.
It's like comparing the injury rate of people sitting on their couch to people currently riding dirt bikes, and then declaring couches are a medical miracle.
That's a great way to put it.
De Hond looks at this press release boasting about a factor of 3 difference, and he is disgusted. He calls it selling tabloid crash disguised as science.
Because the researchers at the RVM absolutely know what a denominator bias is. It's statistics 101.
Exactly. He says he sometimes had to read these reports 3 times just to believe what his eyes were seeing. To him, ignoring that obvious testing bias was deeply deceptive, and it was done intentionally to justify the political pressure being put on the unvaccinated.
But incredibly, that testing bias is just the appetizer in de Hond's critique.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, where his analysis really hits its peak, where the math gets truly dark, is his exploration of mortality rates, and a phenomenon he calls the vaccine effect.
Yes. In epidemiological circles, this is often referred to as the healthy user bias, but de Hond's application of it to the COVID mortality data is fascinating and counterintuitive.
Okay, let's take our time with this because it requires us to really think critically about how medical data is gathered in real time. De Hond focuses on a specific, very influential study from the UMC Utrecht, a major university medical center.
Right.
It was conducted by researchers Mark Bonten and Patricia Brijning.
So the premise of this study was to analyze mortality. They looked at all the death cases in the year 2021, and they cross-referenced the dates of those deaths with the dates those individuals received their vaccinations.
So they are building a timeline of mortality immediately post-vaccination. And when the report comes out, the initial findings look like an absolute home run for the vaccine. The top-line conclusion is that in the first 3 weeks after getting the shot, mortality was 44% lower than what you would statistically expect in that population.
44% lower. If you are a health minister, you are shouting that number from the rooftops. It implies the vaccine drops a shield of invincibility over the patient the moment the needle goes in.
But de Hond, being the data bloodhound that he is, doesn't just read the executive summary. He digs into the raw, week-by-week data tables hidden in the back of the report.
And what he finds is startling.
Yeah.
He separates that 3-week window into individual weeks, and he finds this. In the first week after vaccination, mortality wasn't down 44%. It was a staggering 70% lower.
Wow.
In the second week, it was 45% lower. And by the third week, it was only 25% lower.
The trend line is dropping incredibly fast. But the immediate reaction to that 70% drop in week 1 is usually amazement. A layman looks at that and thinks, my God, the mRNA works miracles in just 48 hours.
Right. But de Hond stops and asks the vital, critical question that the report seemingly glazes over. Why is mortality 70% lower in the first 7 days?
Is it biologically possible?
No. Is it biologically possible for the vaccine to prevent that many deaths before the body has even built up antibodies? Immunologically, that makes no sense. So de Hond looks for the behavioral variable. He asks, who is not getting the vaccine?
And this is his aha moment. It's a realization about medical triage and human reality.
Let's imagine you are an attending physician in a hospital or an elderly care home in early 2021. You are holding a vial of the vaccine. You walk into a room and your patient is in palliative care. They're actively dying.
Right.
Perhaps they have terminal cancer or end-stage heart failure, or they're just in the final days of extreme old age. Do you give them the vaccine?
Of course not. It's standard medical practice. You don't vaccinate someone who's taking their final breaths. It serves no purpose, and it could cause unnecessary discomfort in their final hours.
Exactly. So what happens to the data when you follow that perfectly ethical medical practice?
You create a massive artificial statistical skew. Think about how the categories are defined. By withholding the vaccine from the actively dying, the group of people who are categorized as recently vaccinated inherently excludes anyone who is on death's door.
The people who are going to die that week of any cause were systematically left in the unvaccinated or not recently vaccinated column.
Therefore, the vaccinated group is, by definition, artificially vastly healthier than the general baseline population.
Yes. So when the RIVM or the health ministry points to that 70% drop in week 1 and says, look at the incredible protection of the vaccine, de Hond argues they're taking credit for a complete statistical illusion. The vaccine didn't magically prevent those people from dying. The dying people were just artificially filtered out of the data set before the clock started.
That is the vaccine effect. It's the illusion of efficacy created by selection bias. And de Hond's fury is directed at the fact that the authorities happily, and he believes knowingly, rolled these skewed overestimations into their public messaging.
He explicitly states that a large part of the claimed protection in those early weeks was fake. They used an artificial mathematical quirk to convince the public of a level of immediate safety that didn't exist biologically.
Yeah.
And what's crucial to understand here is that this wasn't just an abstract academic puzzle for de Hond. This specific data analysis deeply, personally impacted his own healthcare choices.
Because we have to make it clear, de Hond was not inherently anti-vax from day one. He wasn't ideologically opposed to the concept of vaccination.
Not at all. In fact, he got the initial 2 doses of the vaccine. He talks about how closely he followed the data coming out of Israel.
Israel is a really important touchstone in his narrative. Israel was a global pioneer in the rollout. They started vaccinating very early, at the end of 2020, and they did it in a very systematic, highly documented way, moving from the oldest, most vulnerable demographics down to the youngest.
De Hond is watching the Israeli dashboards. He tracks the hospital admission numbers, and he sees a clear, verifiable, real-world reduction in severe illness and hospitalizations among the elderly right after that first wave of shots.
Right.
He looked at that data, he trusted it because the denominator wasn't skewed, and he made a rational choice. He saw a tangible benefit for the vulnerable, and based on his age bracket, he got vaccinated. But then, as 2021 rolled on, he kept his eyes on Israel.
And because Israel was months ahead of everyone else, they were the first country to provide hard data showing that the protection from the vaccine was rapidly waning. It was not a durable, years-long shield. This is exactly why Israel had to initiate the booster campaign so quickly.
In the Netherlands, the push for boosters came much later. But De Hond had already seen the future in the Israeli data, and he made a hard pivot. He decided to stop getting boosters.
Wow.
He refused them. And his reasoning was based on several factors he felt the Dutch authorities were actively hiding.
First was the incredibly short duration of the protection. But more alarmingly, he points to data suggesting a negative efficacy over time.
Yes, this is a huge claim. He argues that based on the numbers he was seeing, there were clear indications that 4 to 5 months after receiving a booster, an individual was actually mathematically more susceptible to infection than someone who had not been boosted at all.
That's intense.
He believed the repeated mRNA exposure was having a detrimental effect on natural immune response over the long term.
Which brings up his deep, profound frustration with how the medical establishment treated the concept of natural immunity.
I'm really glad you brought that up because this felt like a massive contradiction to him. Let me play devil's advocate for a second. Historically, before COVID, wasn't it a widely accepted immunological principle that recovering from an infection, getting natural immunity, provided some of the most robust, broad-spectrum protection you could get?
Absolutely. For many infectious diseases, a prior infection provides a more comprehensive cellular memory than a targeted vaccine, which often only trains the body against a specific viral protein, like the spike protein.
But suddenly, in 2021, De Hond says the entire medical establishment seemed to develop collective amnesia. He says doctors were going on television and claiming the exact opposite of historical precedent. They were telling the public that the vaccine offered better, more reliable protection than having actually survived the COVID virus itself.
And for a data guy, hearing a biological contradiction like that being pushed as undisputed consensus is a massive red flag.
When he combined that downplaying of natural immunity with the IVM reports hiding the vaccine effect and the testing bias, his remaining trust in the medical consensus completely evaporated. He felt they were operating as marketing executives for a product, not objective scientists evaluating a fluid situation.
This leads directly to his ultimate policy conclusion. Based on the real data stripped of the healthy user bias, he believes the entire national vaccination approach was catastrophic.
Yeah, he lays out what he thinks should have happened. He says the COVID vaccine should have been treated exactly like the annual flu shot. It should have been strictly, narrowly targeted.
His argument is that the data only showed a clear risk-benefit advantage for those over the age of 60 or those with severe comorbidities.
Protect the vulnerable. But instead, the government adopted a one-size-fits-all sledgehammer approach. They pushed these novel mRNA vaccines on healthy 20-year-olds, on teenagers, and he gets particularly upset about the push to vaccinate pregnant women.
He uses a really striking, almost darkly comedic comparison in the interview regarding pregnant women.
It's a great observation. He notes the supreme irony that society is so incredibly cautious with pregnant women that doctors will advise them against eating a piece of raw tuna or having a bite of unpasteurized brie cheese due to infinitesimally small risks.
Right.
Yet those same doctors were actively, aggressively encouraging pregnant women to take a brand new mRNA technology for a virus that, statistically, posed very little danger to a healthy young woman.
And his critique is that the medical community did this without blinking an eye, without longitudinal safety data, and they completely failed to commission independent research into potential negative side effects or investigate the unexplained excess mortality that started appearing later.
In De Hond's view, every piece of data, every ounce of scientific curiosity was made entirely subservient to a single, unyielding, dominant narrative. Vaccinate everyone, everywhere, at all times.
Okay, if we take all of this, the aerosol denial, the denominator bias, the ignored vaccine effect, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces a really, really uncomfortable question.
Lay it on me.
If Maurice de Hond, a guy who runs polling data for political elections, could look at the RVM reports and spot the testing bias, if he could read the Utrecht mortality study and instantly recognize the vaccine effect triage skew, surely the highly trained, incredibly intelligent epidemiologists, the hospital directors, the university professors, surely they saw it too.
Right. This is the million-dollar question. You cannot tell me that the entire medical and scientific establishment of the Netherlands, thousands of people with PhDs, collectively forgot how to read a statistical denominator overnight.
Exactly.
They aren't stupid. So if they saw the same massive flaws de Hond was seeing, why was he the only one standing in the public square shouting about Bert and Ernie and bananas? Where were the other voices of reason? Why was he seemingly fighting this battle completely alone?
That deafening silence is exactly what we need to explore next. Because as the source material reveals, de Hond wasn't actually alone in his thinking. Not by a long shot.
No, he wasn't. And this brings us to one of the most chilling parts of the interview. We have to pull back the curtain on what was happening behind closed doors, because de Hond reveals a shadow world of scientific dissent that was thriving in private, but was completely suppressed in public.
He introduces a concept to describe this environment, and he uses a very specific, very heavy word, omerta.
Omerta. That is a mafia term. It literally means the code of silence. You don't talk to the cops, you don't go against the family, and if you see something wrong, you keep your mouth shut or there will be severe consequences. Applying a mafia term to the national healthcare system is wild. So let's explore how this omerta actually functioned in practice.
The source material shows that de Hond wasn't isolated in a cabin somewhere writing manifestos. He was actually highly connected. He was organizing regular, albeit very quiet, meetings with other professionals.
He mentions meeting about once a month with a group of like-minded experts. He specifically names a Professor Meester and someone named Helsloot. These were highly credentialed people who were analyzing the pandemic data from their own respective fields of expertise, mathematics, risk management, virology, and they were seeing the exact same flawed patterns, the exact same statistical manipulations that de Hond was seeing.
This private group was in complete agreement. They all believed that the rigid, singular, highly destructive policy of the government needed to be dismantled and replaced with a more targeted, rational approach.
They were sharing data, sharing experiences, trying to figure out how to crack the consensus. But here is the crucial, tragic element of this dynamic. There is a massive, impenetrable wall between what these professionals would readily admit in a private living room over coffee and what they were willing to say when a microphone was put in front of their face.
De Hond shares two specific, highly illustrative anecdotes in the interview that perfectly capture this divide. The first involves a powerful regional official.
Yes, the chairman of a safety board. Now, for context, safety boards in the Netherlands are significant entities. They are regional authorities responsible for crisis management. The chairman is essentially a mayor in wartime.
They have real power.
They have real power and a massive public platform. De Hond says he knew this particular chairman from a previous professional life.
And this powerful public official reaches out to de Hond. But he does it privately.
Over a private message or a quiet phone call. And he tells de Hond, "What you're doing, Maurice, you must absolutely keep going. It is very good what you are doing. Keep it up."
It's essentially a clandestine cheerleading session. Go get him, Maurice.
Right. And de Hond, understandably frustrated by this dynamic, replies, "Wait a minute. You are the chairman of a safety board? You have actual authority. You have access to the press. If you think I'm right, why don't you bring this out into the open? Why don't you use your platform to question the RIVM?"
And the chairman's response?
Yeah.
He simply refuses. He won't do it.
He won't stick his neck out. And the second anecdote is perhaps even more chilling because it doesn't just involve a bureaucrat. It involves the medical establishment directly.
De Hond describes crossing paths with a very prominent figure in the healthcare sector. The source notes this is someone who was frequently seen in the media acting as a public voice for medicine during the crisis.
They start chatting, as parents do, about their kids. De Hond mentions his 13-year-old daughter. He tells this healthcare figure that he had always vaccinated his daughter for all the standard childhood illnesses, measles, mumps, rubella. But looking at the risk-benefit data for teenagers, he absolutely refused to let her get the COVID mRNA vaccine.
And this prominent healthcare figure, this person who goes on television to tell the public to follow the rules, leans in and confides in de Hond. He says, in private, I'm not letting my child get it either.
That alone is shocking hypocrisy. But then comes the kicker. The healthcare figure immediately adds, but I am obviously not going to announce that publicly because it will cost me my job.
It will cost me my job. That one sentence is the absolute crux of the omerta.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let me play devil's advocate for a second, because I can almost hear a public health official defending this. Couldn't you argue that in the middle of a once-in-a-century crisis, unified messaging is essential? If every single doctor is on television contradicting the National Health Authority, doesn't that cause massive public panic and non-compliance? Maybe this doctor was just being responsible by keeping his doubts private.
That is the exact justification the institutions use. The argument is that science must speak with one voice during an emergency to maintain order. But de Hond's counterargument is that when unified messaging requires suppressing critical data, ignoring biological realities, and terrifying doctors into silence, you aren't doing science anymore. You are doing public relations. And public relations doesn't stop a virus, but it does destroy trust.
Exactly. When unified messaging means a doctor is afraid to admit he wouldn't give a treatment to his own child, the system is fundamentally broken. When the interviewer asked de Hond why he thinks so many highly educated people behave this way, de Hond doesn't sugarcoat it. He calls it cowardly.
Yeah.
But interestingly, he also has a level of grace about it. He acknowledges that this is just how human beings are wired. Self-preservation is a hell of a drug.
To explain why his own behavior was so vastly different, why he was willing to be the loud, obnoxious voice in the room, he shares a deeply personal philosophical story. It's a moral framework he learned from his father.
It's a powerful story that defines his entire approach to the pandemic. His father told him, "Imagine you are walking down the street, it's a normal day, and suddenly, on the opposite side of the road, you see an old lady being viciously beaten up by a mugger. You have two choices."
Two fundamental human reactions.
Choice one, you can keep walking. You keep your head down, you pretend you didn't see it because you are afraid, you calculate the risk, and you realize that if you cross that street to intervene, the mugger might turn on you and you'll get beaten up too. That is the biological survival instinct. Protect yourself.
But choice two is to cross the street.
Yeah.
You accept the risk, you step into the fray, and you try to help her.
And his father told him this. If you choose the first option, if you keep walking out of fear and you find out the next day that the old lady died from her injuries, you will have to live with that crushing guilt for the rest of your life.
Wow.
The physical safety you preserved isn't worth the moral rot inside you. From this lesson, de Hond adopted a personal, lifelong motto: whoever is afraid gets beaten too.
Whoever is afraid gets beaten too. It's a profound indictment of the passive bystander. It suggests that by yielding to fear, you lose a piece of your humanity, which is a defeat in itself.
So how does this moral framing contrast with the survival instincts of the professionals who stayed quiet?
It creates a stark dichotomy. We romanticize science as this pure, fearless, noble pursuit of absolute truth. But de Hond's experience reveals that science is an institution. And institutions are made of people.
Right.
People who have mortgages to pay, kids to put through college, desires for peer approval, reliance on government research grants, and a deep, visceral fear of public humiliation.
The omerta wasn't enforced by guys with baseball bats. It was enforced by the threat of professional annihilation.
Exactly. The environment of intense institutional pressure created a catastrophic chilling effect. If you stepped out of line, if you pointed out the denominator flaw in the RVM's testing data, you weren't just engaging in polite academic disagreement. You were placing yourself completely outside the social and professional order. You became a pariah.
The TV doctor knew it. It will cost me my job.
De Hond argues that because of this omerta, science completely fundamentally failed during the COVID era. The system broke because the individuals within it lost the freedom to speak their minds. The peer review process, the internal debates, the very engines of scientific discovery were paralyzed by fear.
We'll have to look at why de Hond was personally immune to this paralysis. Why was he able to cross the street when the doctors couldn't? He admits he had a massive structural advantage.
His independence.
Right. He didn't work for a hospital. He didn't rely on government grants for his lab.
He owned his own polling company. He owned his own website. His livelihood wasn't tethered to the very institutions he was critiquing. That financial and professional independence functioned as an armor. It allowed him to cross the street to help the old lady without worrying about his family starving.
But that doesn't mean he didn't take a beating. He crossed the street and he got hit hard. He talks about the severe personal cost. He talks about being canceled long before that was a common term. He was publicly labeled a wappie, which is this derogatory Dutch slang term for a conspiracy theorist, a nut job, someone entirely divorced from reality.
He specifically calls out a prominent science journalist, Martin Kuhlmans, for waging a campaign against him on Twitter, writing what de Hond describes as the most ridiculous things.
But de Hond's attitude toward these attacks is fascinating. He's incredibly stoic about it. He essentially says, the vitriol they throw at me says a lot more about their own psychology and fear than it does about my data. It wasn't going to stop him from communicating facts he felt he could mathematically substantiate.
But the tragedy, from his perspective, is that the brilliant medical professionals who did agree with him couldn't take those same hits. He mentions a doctor who appeared on a serious television program called News Sir. De Hond found the doctor's televised comments intriguing, so he reached out to him privately. And surprise, surprise, he discovered they were entirely on the same page regarding the flawed policies. But on television, that doctor could only go up to a certain invisible government-approved line. If he crossed it, the repercussions were career-ending.
Okay, so this creates a massive societal pressure cooker. If the vital scientific debate can't happen in the university lecture halls and it can't happen in the hospital boardrooms because of this omerta, where does the energy go? It doesn't just evaporate. The pressure has to release somewhere.
Exactly. The debate had to migrate. Because the traditional avenues of scientific discourse were locked down by self-preservation, the battle violently spilled out into the broader public arena. It moved directly into the media ecosystem.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most explosive act of our deep dive. The battleground. Let's look at the media landscape and what de Hond views as the ultimate betrayal, the watchdogs versus the lapdogs.
This is where we see the structural polarization of society play out in real time, right on our screens.
Let's trace de Hond's media journey because it perfectly illustrates the fracture. We go back to March 2020, the very beginning of the pandemic. De Hond has his initial findings about aerosols and data flaws, the things he felt were absolutely critical to saving lives and preventing economic ruin. His first instinct isn't to go rogue. He doesn't start a podcast in his basement. His first instinct is to use the traditional respected channels of public information.
He plays by the old rules.
Right. He writes up his detailed analysis and he submits it as an op-ed to De Volkskrant, which is one of the most prominent, respected, high-circulation daily newspapers in the Netherlands. It's the paper of record.
And what is their response?
They flat out reject it. He says the editors told him they wouldn't publish it because the experts said it wasn't true.
Wow.
Think about that. The traditional gatekeepers of information shut the gate, not because his data was mathematically proven wrong, but because it conflicted with the approved consensus of the OMT. So what does a seasoned data analyst with his own independent platform do when the newspapers refuse to print his charts? He publishes them himself.
He bypasses the gatekeepers entirely and posts it on his own website, maurice.nl.
Yes. And the reaction from the public is instantaneous and explosive. De Hond notes that previously, in his normal polling career, he was thrilled if an article on his site got a few thousand reads. Suddenly, his COVID analyses are getting 300,000 to 400,000 views per article.
That is a staggering metric. It proves that the demand for an alternative narrative, for a different perspective on the X-ray, was massive. People felt instinctively that the official story had holes in it.
And this wasn't just an isolated phenomenon happening to de Hond. The source material outlines how this era birthed an entire robust ecosystem of alternative media channels in the Netherlands. Independent platforms sprang up overnight to fill the void left by the mainstream press. Channels like De Nieuwe Wereld, Wismerts, and Blackbix.
And de Hond became a frequent, highly prominent guest on these alternative platforms. He was producing his own videos, spreading his findings about aerosol transmission and statistical bias to hundreds of thousands of people. He argues that these alternative channels rose up organically, precisely because a huge swath of the population felt the traditional media was completely failing to inform them, or worse, that the traditional media was actively conspiring to hide the truth.
This leads to de Hond's most searing, fundamental critique of the traditional press. It's about the watchdog metaphor.
The acid test of journalism in a free society.
Exactly. In a functioning democracy, the media is supposed to be the fourth estate. They're supposed to be the watchdog. Their job is to keep the authorities in check, to ask the tough, uncomfortable questions, to scrutinize the data, and to bark when the government oversteps its bounds. De Hond argues that during the pandemic, the traditional media entirely, catastrophically failed this acid test.
He says they underwent a grotesque transformation. They morphed from being the watchdog of democracy into becoming the watchdog of the authorities.
A lapdog for the government, but a vicious, foaming-at-the-mouth attack dog toward anyone else. He says the mainstream press started barking at everyone who had a different story. They weren't challenging Van Dissel on his absurd Burden-Ernie logic. They were acting as Van Dissel's enforcers, attacking anyone who dare point out the missing crocodiles.
To illustrate this complete lack of journalistic friction, de Hond points to the omnipresence of certain state-approved experts on television talk shows. He specifically names Ab Osterhaus, a very prominent virologist.
De Hond's quote on this is quite pointed, and it highlights the absurdity of the television landscape at the time. If Osterhaus couldn't make it, Osterhaus came, and if he couldn't make it, Osterhaus came to tell us how it was.
It's a humorous way of describing a deeply depressing reality, an absolute airtight echo chamber. There was zero room for a counter-narrative. The bookers for these talk shows were essentially just cycling through the same 3 government-approved voices every single night.
And when de Hond finally did manage to get a rare, highly contested spot on a mainstream talk show called OP1, the producers didn't let him just present his data. He says Osterhaus was deliberately placed right opposite him to act as his chaperone.
A chaperone. That implies Osterhaus wasn't there to engage in a genuine scientific debate about aerosols or denominators, but to manage de Hond, to neutralize his points, and to signal to the audience that de Hond's data was dangerous.
Meanwhile, on the flip side of the media divide, de Hond notes the complete cowardice of the establishment. Members of the official outbreak management team completely refused to appear on any of the alternative media channels. They wouldn't step out of their friendly, brightly lit mainstream environments to face real critics on Black Bricks or a De New World. They stayed in their safe zones.
Now, to be fair to the source material, the interviewer in the video actually challenges de Hond on this point. It's a good moment of pushback. The interviewer asks, hey, wait a minute. Wasn't there a danger that these alternative channels were just creating their own equally rigid echo chambers? Were they really any better than the mainstream, or were they just peddling a different brand of dogma?
And de Hond defends the alternative space, but with nuance. He acknowledges that, sure, sometimes you would hear some wild, unscientific stuff on alternative media. He mentions people claiming the virus didn't exist at all, which he strongly, vehemently disagreed with. He knew the virus was real and dangerous.
Right.
But he argues that on the alternative channels, there was at least a breadth of perspectives. There was debate. The other side of the argument was discussed even if the OMT refused to show up, whereas the traditional media simply locked the doors and threw away the key.
But we have to dig deeper here. We have to ask why. Why did the media landscape fracture so violently? Why did the traditional media willingly surrender their watchdog role to become state enforcers? And perhaps more terrifyingly, why was the public so willing to accept it and even demand it?
Let's look at it from another angle. Let's dive into the psychology of the audience, because de Hond has a very clear mathematical theory for why the public lost its mind. It all comes down to the weaponization of fear. He claims that from day one, the public was made unimaginably, artificially terrified by the government and the media.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he asserts a specific metric for this. He claims that the actual chance of death for an average 60-year-old was mathematically overestimated in the media modeling by a factor of 100 to 150 times.
100 to 150 times. If you inject that level of pure statistical terror into a population every single night on the evening news, you fundamentally alter their psychological processing.
You do. It's a fascinating and terrifying psychological mechanism. When you make people unimaginably terrified and present a strict set of rules as their only savior, well, anyone who questions those rules isn't seen as a helpful critic.
What are they seen as?
They are seen as a lethal threat. The implicit psychological contract between the state and the citizen became, follow these exact rules without question, and we will keep you from dying.
Okay, I see exactly where this is going. If you are a terrified citizen and you deeply believe that contract.
Yes. Insert a dissenting voice like Maurice de Hond into that terrified society. If you are sitting on your couch, paralyzed by fear, and you believe the government's rules are the only thing keeping the monster outside your door, then someone who questions those rules on television isn't viewed as a helpful scientist engaging in peer review. They aren't viewed as a quirky data analyst pointing out a denominator flaw in a PDF.
They are viewed as a saboteur, someone trying to tear down the very walls that are keeping you alive.
Precisely. The psychological response from the public isn't intellectual engagement. It's visceral, violent aggression. This perfectly explains the extreme polarization and why de Hond received the reaction he did.
It explains the madness. He mentions that after his appearance on that talk show OP1, where he was literally just talking about aerosols, about opening windows and improving ventilation, he received 25 emails from viewers hoping he would end up on a ventilator in the ICU.
Wishing a horrific death upon someone for suggesting a virus is airborne, that is not a rational scientific disagreement. That is fear-induced mass psychosis. And de Hond argues that the traditional media's greatest crime was not just getting the science wrong occasionally, but actively feeding, amplifying, and profiting from this mass fear psychosis, instead of doing their job to calm the public and present nuanced, balanced data.
He points out that the government and the media never bothered to remove the fear from society, even when the real-world data started showing the virus was far less lethal than those initial doomsday models predicted. They kept the fear dialed to 11 because fear ensures compliance. And the media loved the ratings.
And because of that immense systemic failure, de Hond believes a massive, perhaps permanent wedge was driven into society. A fundamental disgust toward traditional media and government institutions was born among a huge segment of the population, and it hasn't gone away.
So how does a society heal from that kind of trauma? The interviewer asks him this exact question, like how do these two worlds, the mainstream and the alternative, the compliant and the skeptical, how do they ever find each other again? And de Hond's answer is heavy.
It requires a massive societal reckoning.
He says the traditional media and the health institutions need deep, profound introspection. They need to stand up and admit that they blindly followed a dominant narrative, that they manipulated data, and that they sacrificed their watchdog role for access and compliance.
He makes a huge historical comparison here. He compares what needs to happen to South Africa.
Yes. He invokes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For those who might not know, after the fall of apartheid in South Africa, the country didn't just move on. They held massive, painful public hearings where the perpetrators of abuses had to publicly confess their crimes in order to receive amnesty. It was about dragging all the dark, ugly truths out into the light so the country could heal. De Hond is saying that the media and the medical establishment's betrayal of trust during the pandemic was so profound, the societal damage so deep, that we need a similar public reckoning.
They need to stand before the public and say, here is where we took the wrong turn. Here is where we let fear dictate our science. Here is where we silence dissenting doctors to protect our narrative.
But, predictably, he is incredibly pessimistic that this will ever happen. He points to the journalists who are still attacking him online years later as proof that the media has zero interest in self-reflection. They are incapable of admitting fault. They are still desperately protecting the narrative because their egos are tied to it.
Wow. Okay. We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground here. We've dissected an entire societal breakdown through the eyes of one incredibly persistent data analyst.
Yeah, let's try to synthesize this journey.
We started by looking at the sheer bewilderment of the aerosol debate in August 2020. We broke down the Burton-Ernie logic, where top authorities use the absence of a negative outcome during a total societal lockdown to stubbornly dismiss airborne transmission, completely abandoning basic scientific variables.
From there, we moved into the hard numbers. We explored how a pollster's eye spotted the denominator bias in the testing data, where the authorities compared sick, unvaccinated people to healthy vaccinated people to exaggerate efficacy. And we unpacked the dark reality of the vaccine effect, the statistical illusion created by the triage process, where dying people are left unvaccinated, making the vaccinated group look miraculously, artificially healthier in those critical first few weeks.
Then we explored the chilling reality of the omerta, the mafia-style code of silence among highly trained professionals. We heard how doctors and safety chairmen saw the same data flaws, but were too terrified of losing their jobs and social standing to speak out. We saw the survival instinct override the moral imperative to cross the street and help the old lady.
And finally, we looked at how this paralyzing institutional fear spilled over into the media landscape. We saw traditional outlets abandon their watchdog role to become lapdogs and enforcers for the state, feeding a 100-fold exaggerated fear to the public to ensure compliance. And we saw how that betrayal birthed an entirely new, polarized ecosystem of alternative media.
It is a comprehensive, devastating critique of institutional failure from top to bottom.
And this brings us back to you, the listener. Why does this deep dive matter? Why spend all this time unpacking Maurice de Hond's specific perspective? Because whether you agree with every mathematical point he makes, or whether you think he is entirely wrong about the vaccines, his lens highlights something vital about the human condition.
Hmm.
It highlights how incredibly, dangerously difficult it is to separate objective, cold data from raw human fear during a global crisis.
It shows us how fragile our information ecosystems truly are. It demonstrates how quickly the scientific method can be corrupted into public relations when dissent is penalized rather than investigated.
Exactly. When we started this deep dive, we talked about the X-ray machine. We want crises to be binary. We want the broken bone to be obvious and the cure to be absolute and unquestionable. But global crises aren't simple engineering problems. They're human problems. And when the waters get murky, the institutions we rely on to read the X-ray are subject to the same panics, biases, ego preservation, and fears as the rest of us.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as we close out. If a society's institutions and media become wholly unified in a single narrative during a crisis, is that a sign of ultimate scientific triumph? Or is it a warning sign that the watchdogs have stopped barking? The next time a global crisis hits, how will you evaluate the information you are being told, and more importantly, the information you aren't hearing?
A brilliant question to leave a ringing in our ears. Thank you all for joining us on this incredibly complex, murky deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking for the missing crocodiles, and always, always seek out multiple perspectives. We will catch you on the next one.